Today, we journey back to the Malay Peninsula of the 1860s, a land where tin was treasure, rivers became battlefields, and rival chiefs fought in a struggle that would draw in princes, pirates, and adventurers from across the seas. At the heart of this tale lies the town of Klang, a modest settlement near the river's mouth, yet the key to Selangor's wealth and power. Here, two rival leaders, Raja Mahdi and Tunku Kudin, fought bitterly for mastery. The feud drew in the ruling Bugis elite, the migrant clans of Sumatra, and even a French artilleryman with a ragtag band of mercenaries. It is a story of siege and starvation, of floating forts drifting down the river, of shifting loyalties and bitter betrayals, and of how the Battle of Klang set the stage for British intervention in the Malay states and the remaking of Malaya's destiny. The Malay Peninsula in the 1860s was a land racked by anarchy, internal strife, and civil war. Much of it born of succession disputes in the royal houses and bitter rivalries among the Malay chiefs. In Selangor, these divisions were sharpened by the tin boom, which gave rise to violent quarrels over the rich tin fields and lucrative trading centers of the state. Selangor's elderly ruler, Sultan Abdul Samad, had withdrawn to his garden in Langat and showed little interest in governing, leaving his sons and relatives to quarrel over control of the river valleys, the tin districts, and the trade hubs. "It is a matter for the boys," he was reported to have said. "They can fight it out." Compounding this chaotic state of affairs was the deep enmity between the Bugis ruling elite and the Sumatran Malay immigrant communities who opened the mines, traded in tin, and ferried it along the rivers. These included the Rawa from West Sumatra, the Mandeling from the north, and the Batubara from the northeast. Their rivalries with the Bugis stretched back to the wars of the 18th century, when the Bugis first arrived in Selangor and established themselves as rulers. The richest of Selangor's regions was undoubtedly the Klang Valley. In 1857, its chief, Raja Abdullah, brought Chinese miners to work the tin fields around Kuala Lumpur, transforming it into a flourishing center of commerce, while Klang itself became an important port of export. Abdullah, a Bugis, and his men controlled the coast and the estuary as far as his headquarters in Klang. Upstream, however, the river was the domain of the Datuk Dagang, the headman of the Sumatran boatmen who carried the tin. One man who was not content with this arrangement was Raja Mahdi, a dashing Selangor chief of the old Malay type. He was the son of Raja Sulaiman, the former ruler of Klang, and felt cheated when, upon his father's death in 1853, Raja Abdullah was appointed in his place. There was also a woman at the heart of this quarrel. Mahdi had been betrothed to the Sultan's daughter, Raja Arfa, also known as Tunku Chi. But engagement was abruptly broken off. Instead, the Sultan married her to a Kedah prince, Tunku Dia Udin, better known as Tunku Kudin. and appointed him as Viceroy of Selangor. The Surat Kuasa, or letter of authority, empowered Kuddin to govern the state in the Sultan's name and restore order. It only required a spark for Mahdi to declare war, and that spark was struck in Kuala Lumpur, when a Bugis man killed a youth of the Batu Bara clan named Rasul at the stockade there. The head of the Batu Bara Malays, Muhammad Akib, demanded punishment for the killer and blood money, but Raja Abdullah did nothing. Furious, Akib turned to Mahdi. The two vowed revenge, and in November 1866 raised the revolt against Abdullah. The Klang War had begun. Mahdi was bold and skillful, but he lacked the means to wage a long campaign. His cannon and gunpowder from Kuala Selangor were of poor quality, relics of the old Dutch wars in the previous century. Salvation came in the form of Baba Tek Cheng, a wealthy Malacca merchant, who furnished him with rice, arms, and ammunition, in exchange for promises of land and tin concessions should Mahdi prevail. Mahdi and the Batu Bara Malays were soon joined by Mandailing allies, and their force now numbered over 500 men. They advanced upon Klang in junks, attacking from both up and down the river. The Bugis garrison was taken completely by surprise. Mahdi's men seized the hill fort overlooking the town and constructed a stockade below by the mosque on the river bank. The Bugis entrenched themselves at Raja Abdullah's warehouse, Gedong Raja Abdullah, barely half a mile away. Unlike Raja Mahdi, Raja Abdullah was more a trader than a warrior. He fled to Malacca, leaving his son Raja Ismail in charge. Cut off by Mandailing boats, the Bugis in the warehouse were besieged. Abdullah sent an armed flotilla of junks from Malacca to relieve them, but when the ships opened fire, they discovered to their horror that their guns could not be raised high enough to strike the fort on the hill. Shot after shot splashed harmlessly into the river. Their naval assault a complete failure, the Bugis attempted a storming assault up the hill the next day. At the stockade below, Muhammad Akib of the Batu Bara Malays met them head-on, charging into their ranks with sword, shield and kris. He was struck down by Wak Sigala, the Bugis leader, who speared him and shot him through the chest. Yet the Bugis were raked by crossfire from both the stockade and the fort, and they fell back to the warehouse with heavy losses. When his body was found, Muhammad Akib was buried within the fort the next day, where his grave may still be seen today. For 5 relentless months, the struggle dragged on. The Mandailing boats were blockading the river, and supplies could not reach the Bugis garrison in the warehouse. By March 1867, they were starving, and Raja Ismail sued for safe passage out. Mahdi granted it, and Klang was now his. Yet the war was far from over. In the years ahead, Ismail would muster new allies, including former pirates from the Riau Archipelago and from Buru Island in Maluku. Loans, arms and men were also supplied by Baba Tek I, a Malacca merchant. Crucially, Ismail also won over the Datuk Dagang, the leader of the Sumatran Malays, and several Batu Bara Malays who had previously been allies of Mahdi. Among them was the brother of Rasul, the youth whose death had first sparked the quarrel. Mahdi, like Abdullah before him, had refused blood compensation when one of his followers, his own brother, killed a follower of the Datuk Dagang. By doing nothing, Mahdi lost his strongest allies. In August 1869, Ismail finally struck. From Malacca, he sailed with his flotilla and reached the Klang estuary at midnight. At dawn, to shouts of "Amok! Amok!" his men attacked one of Mahdi's forts guarding the entrance to the Klang River. The 30 defenders were caught napping. None of the fort's guns were manned, and there was no one on watch. Hearing the sound of gunfire, they fled in panic, even leaving their weapons behind. Ismail's men suffered but one casualty, a poor fighter mistakenly killed by his own brother in the dark confusion. From this captured fort, Ismail turned the guns upon another of Mahdi's forts on the opposite bank of the river, and upon Mahdi's schooner, the Sri Lingga. That fort was manned by Batubara Malays under Mahdi's lieutenant, Kunting. Persuaded by his men to withdraw to Klang for reinforcements, Kunting sailed up the river on the schooner. And when he left, the Batubara Malays manning the fort promptly surrendered without firing a shot. They had defected to Ismail. The mouth of the Klang was now in Ismail's hands. He built a stockade at Sungai Pinang, guarding the entrance into Klang from the sea. Meanwhile, his Batubara allies marched from the east and raised another stockade at Bukit Kuda, cutting Ismail off from any help from Kuala Lumpur and the interior. Heavy chains were stretched across the river at both stockades, stopping any navigation by boat into Klang. The siege had begun, but Ismail only had a few hundred men, enough to blockade the town, but not enough to take Mahdi's fort by storm. He would need more help to do that. That help would come in the form of Tunku Kudin. He had earlier returned to Kedah and gathered a force of 500 followers. He also sought huge loans from 3 people: his mother, a Malacca merchant named Baba Tei, and a British merchant in Singapore, James Guthrie Davison. Davison would later become the first British resident of Selangor. With this large war chest, he chartered a steamer, the Rumbau, and 72 praus and junks. This fleet then sailed for Klang, arriving there in October 1869, 3 months into Raja Ismail's siege of the town. At first, he approached Raja Mahdi offering to mediate in the conflict with Raja Ismail. But Mahdi angrily rejected his offer, saying that the Surat Kuasa or letter authority Kudin had received from the Sultan was a forgery. Kudin then cast his lot with Raja Ismail's besieging forces. Kudin was no military strategist or commander, but he did have an experienced European officer, a Frenchman by the name of De Fontaine. De Fontaine brought with him a motley force of sepoys, consisting of Indian and Malay ruffians and criminals recruited from Penang, Malacca and Singapore. They were led by European officers who were described as drifters who failed to get work in Singapore, including a former officer of the Dutch colonial forces called Van Hagen, a failed Italian businessman named Cavaliero, and Pennyfather, a former British Army sergeant. De Fontaine's sepoys were described as thin, sickly, shabby, and dirty. They were no match for Mahdi's seasoned warriors. But it was De Fontaine's skill with artillery that proved decisive. He learned his trade as a midshipman in the French Navy and had 18-pounder guns mounted on small boats as improvised sledges. These were dragged up the slopes of hills and other high ground overlooking Mahdi's stockades at the warehouse on Bukit Jawa and in the fort. From there, De Fontaine poured a plunging fire onto Mahdi's positions almost daily. Kudin was also well provided with a variety of cannon, and one of his commanders, Penghulu Hamzah, constructed a tall watchtower or langkangan, from which he used a pair of binoculars to direct the fire of the gunners, an innovation in Malay warfare. Mahdi, however, remained defiant. His Mandailing allies built rafts, which they called Kota Berjalan, or walking forts. These rafts had cannon mounted under wooden canopies and armed men to provide covering fire. These rafts were floated downriver to attack the besiegers' stockades, but the chains held them back. Even the Mahdi's schooner, Sri Linga, was converted into a floating battery and ordered to attack the Bukit Kuda stockade upstream. It too became ensnared in the chains. Only by hammering through the iron with sledgehammers could the schooner break free, sailing upstream and bringing some supplies to the fort. Mahdi then ordered the schooner to launch a second attack, this time on Ismail's stockade at Sungai Pinang, downstream towards the Klang estuary. Again, the schooner was caught in the chains there and exchanged fire for 2 days with Ismail's stockade before it could break free. However, it was low tide and the boat ran aground before it could reach the estuary. The Mandailings abandoned the ship and trudged back to Klang on foot, empty-handed. With the river still blockaded and very little food getting through Kudin's pickets in the surrounding jungle, the situation for the inhabitants of Klang was now desperate. An expected convoy of supplies bought by Mahdi from a Penang trader, Edward Bacon, failed to get through. Mahdi's followers started deserting him in droves. When a final last-ditch assault by the floating batteries on the river stockades failed, Mahdi escaped to Sungai Buloh and then on to Kuala Selangor. The remaining commander in Raja Mahdi's fort surrendered, on the condition that there would be no looting by the victors. It was March 1870, and the siege had lasted a weary 6 months. Kudin was now master of Klang, and the battle was over. However, the war would drag on for another 4 years. In Kuala Selangor, Mahdi would be joined by 2 formidable Malay warriors, Said Mashur and Raja Mahmud, and the fight there would soon draw the British into the fray. The war as a whole now shifted to Kuala Lumpur, where large battles between Kudin's and Mahdi's Malay and Chinese allies would lay waste to the city and leave its inhabitants in devastation and ruin. But that is a story for another video on my channel. If you enjoyed this particular tale of betrayal, siege and floating gun batteries, do give this video a like, share your thoughts below, or subscribe for more intrigue and clash of arms. Until then though, cheerio!